Thank you, Jeremy. Let me start by, it's pretty loud, isn't it? Does it sound about right? I feel like Darth Vader, when he puts on that helmet, boom. I used to have this kind of thing back in Madison, and sometimes the battery would wear out. It's like Darth Vader losing his helmet. How many people here have some background in the First Amendment? Okay, that wasn't a very courageous show of hands, but a few of you. So I guess this is going to be kind of a crash course. Jeremy gave me 30 minutes. So this is the Honors College, so it's not going to be First Amendment for Dummies. We'll call it First Amendment for Honors. Okay? Sort of the greatest hits in the First Amendment area. Yeah, a little bit loud. Yeah, thank you. Right. So I want to focus on two, I'll keep talking so you can get it right.
Yeah, keep talking.
Focus on two primary areas. One is sort of core doctrine, which has to do with the basic reasons for the protections we have for free speech. And then I want to talk about some cases and deeper principles. So the doctrine and principles, and then talk about limits toward the end. So being in Houston, I guess when I'm talking about principles, Jeremy's here, he'll beat a drum once to signal to you that I'm going to pitch a principle towards you. Get this? You know, Astros? And when it's doctrine, he'll beat a drum twice. So you know it's coming your way. Sorry, it's in the news. What can I do? Let me start with a question. How many people here have ever changed your mind about something that really matters? A lot of you. Okay? Why? Why did you change your mind? Very quickly. 30 minutes, can't spend a lot of time on that, but you learned something new. You got more experience in life, so you had a different point of view on things. So really, when all said and done, if I had to pick a central question that the First Amendment's concerned with is letting people change their minds. Because people think one thing, later on they think another thing. And that's really why we need freedom of speech. Among the other reasons I'll be talking about. Because nobody has the total answer to everything. When I was hired at Madison in 1985, I was at Notre Dame, and my first book was called Nazis in Skokie. And I argued that the Nazis should not have had the right to demonstrate in Skokie. It's a Holocaust survivor town, 30,000 Jewish students among 70,000 citizens. And later on, that got me the job at Madison, that book. Later on, I changed my mind. I became more of a libertarian on free speech and said, at least in that context, they should have had the right. So here's my career, the book that sort of launched me. I said A, and then later I said not A. I changed my mind. So did Madison hire me on the basis of fraud? Always kind of worried about that, but we'll talk more about fraud a little bit later. So let me start by talking about core doctrinal principles when it comes to free speech. The state of Texas passes a law, and it says you may not wear an official military uniform for any purpose outside of the military, say for a play or something like that, if in so doing you are speaking negatively of the military. Is that clear? That's the law? You may not wear a military uniform outside the context of the military unless if you are speaking negatively about the military. Is that constitutional? Anyone? No. Mr. Monroe, Professor Monroe.
Well, if it's unconstitutional, there were sure a lot of people when I was going to college who were doing that very thing.
Right, when did you go?
Let's just leave that.
In other words, he went when I went.
During the Vietnam War.
Right. Okay. Is it constitutional?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I was just doing it.
Okay. So if you speak fairly in the military, you may wear the uniform. If you study First Amendment, that's a core violation. The first principle of the First Amendment is that the government shall not pick favorites based on content, but in particular on viewpoint. So you're allowed to speak favorably of the military in this context, but not unfavorably. That's viewpoint discrimination. First Amendment, no. Nazis have a right to speak, so does Mother Teresa. Now we'll see, there's certain contexts where Nazi speech might be somewhat limited, but in general, they have to be treated pretty much the same. Second factor. Has anybody here ever told a lie? Maybe a little white lie? Michael's nodding his head. You want to tell us quickly? Nope. Okay, at least you're honest, you told a lie. Maybe for the good reason, I hope. Right? Do you have a First Amendment right to lie? Let's say that I'm at a gathering and I want to impress people. So I lie about my military background. I don't have one. I was in Vietnam during the Vietnam era. I had a high draft number. I'm not proud of the fact I didn't serve. As a matter of fact, I wish I had, but I didn't. But I want to impress people at this gathering. So at our dinner last night, we had Jeremy and two other professors. And yeah, I served in Vietnam. May the government punish me for lying about my military service? Can you imagine, is lying actually protected speech? Well, there's a real case, Alvarez versus US. Just a few years ago, a guy was lying about his military service. He actually claimed that he won the Medal of Honor or some other major medal. Anybody here think that's a good thing? It's not a good thing, right? Can he be punished by federal law for doing that? The answer by the Supreme Court, and I think correctly, 8-1, no. We exaggerate all the time to impress people, right? I used to play basketball. I had some game. It just makes me proud to be at Princeton, because I used to, Houston, I used to watch teams all the time play basketball too. And the Supreme Court ruled that this is just the First Amendment, and there's other cases have talked about this. There is no such thing, except in limited contexts, like libel, like fraud, where truth is the test as to whether or not you're allowed to speak or not. Okay, there's no such thing as a false idea under the First Amendment. Seems kind of shocking, doesn't it? Now, if you lie about your military service to get a government benefit, that would be fraud. So that would cross a line. If you say something false about someone that harms their reputation, you can be sued for libel. But otherwise, it's protected speech. If you want to go to the street corner, play Dostoevsky, 2 and 2 is 5, you have every right in the world to do that. But we'll see certain contexts where you don't have that right. Third major area, you may not be compelled to express an idea or belief that you do not believe in. That's called the doctrine against compelled speech. So an example here, we just had a New Hampshire primary. Anyone know what's on a New Hampshire license plate? I have one in my office back home. A student gave it to me as a gift. Live free or die. What if you don't believe in that maxim? It's on every New Hampshire license plate. Do you have a right to cover that up because you don't believe in that? Suppose you're a Jehovah's Witness and you don't believe in live free or die because God is your highest authority, not the state. Do you have a right to cover that up on your license plate? Do you have a right to a different license plate? The answer is yes, because that's an expression of an opinion, of a value. And the Supreme Court held, 7-2, that the state does not have a right to make you have that on your license plate. You can get a different license plate, or you may cover it up. All right? So, what if a state, for example, had on its license plate a pro-life proposition, and you're in favor of pro-choice? Would you have to have that on your license plate? Or vice versa, going the other direction on the abortion question. What if a state allows you as a private citizen to put a statement on your license plate that you want on your own? Is that okay? And the answer is probably yes in that case. Okay, so that's the third principle. You may not be compelled by the state or the government to express a viewpoint that you're not in favor of. It's anti-compelled speech. Fourth principle, anti-paternalism. Here's a real case, 1969. Guys in front of the White House, Vietnam War era. Points to the White House and says, if I'm drafted, the first person I'm going to put in the sights of my gun is LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time. Is that punishable speech? He seems to be kind of threatening to shoot the president in the future. Can he be punished because maybe someone will hear that and go do it? Well, the answer is no. Court said this is rhetorical. Going back to what Monroe said, back at that time, a lot of things were being said about presidents, right? And about the government. That was relatively mild, maybe. And the court ruled that this was protected speech because you're not allowed, the government is not allowed to punish speech or to censor speech because someone might do something bad about it. It has to be a direct incitement to imminent lawless action that's likely to occur. So that's the fourth major principle, doctrine of the First Amendment. And finally, the fifth point, say someone's giving a talk and you don't like what that person has to say. Are you allowed to interfere with that person's speech by your own counter speech in such a manner that that person is not going to be able to be heard? Do you have a right to counter-protest in a way which disrupts that person's speech? The answer to that is no. Okay? It's the doctrine of the heckler's veto. If a person is talking and you disapprove of that person, you may counter-protest. You may put up a sign. You may even sort of heckle. You don't have a right to do it in a way which disrupts that person's speech. And for several reasons. The rights of listeners, the right of the speaker, the right of people to hear the speaker, the right of people who brought the speaker in, the university, the right of the institution to have an open forum for ideas. So this is the other key principle of First Amendment doctrine. You do not have a right to disrupt the lawful speech of another person. So a question you should bear in mind when you're doing the Q&A is, why should we have these doctrines? Do they make sense? And taking kind of a risk, we're allowing all sorts of speakers and writers to say things that might be very upsetting to people based on their viewpoints. Why should we, as a democratic society, accept that kind of doctrine? And I hope to make some case for that, but we can talk about limits also. Now, getting back to more basic things. Free speech and freedom of religion are very much connected in our constitutional history. Going back to James Madison, we have free speech and freedom of religion because of the importance of freedom of conscience, the importance of that to the individual. And a classic case in this regard is Justice Robert Jackson's famous opinion, West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett. Barnett was a Jehovah's Witness. A lot of First Amendment cases are based on Jehovah's Witnesses pushing their claims. And what Justice Jackson said in this case, it's a case in which Barnett refused to stand and pledge allegiance to the flag in West Virginia during World War II. And the Supreme Court said the following, that he had a right not to stand. This is a compelled speech case. Quote unquote, compulsory unification of opinion. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe which shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism or religion, or any other matter of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act on their faith therein. This is a testament to the integrity of the individual intellectual conscience, so to speak. Holmes said in another context, Justice Holmes, a famous First Amendment advocate, Supreme Court justice, if there is any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, It is a principle of free thought, not free thought for those who agree with us, but with freedom for the thought we hate. That's sort of where the rubber hits the road. That's the litmus paper test. Freedom for the thought we hate. Well, why is that such an important principle? It's worth thinking about. First of all, we don't censor speech that we don't hate. We let it happen. No one's going to be disturbed. But why should we protect speech that we hate? Especially if there's a universal agreement that this kind of speech is hateful. Something for us to think about and talk about later. But it is a core First Amendment axiom. According to Justice Cardozo, freedom of expression is the matrix, the indispensable condition of nearly every other form of freedom. Now, one key aspect of all this doctrine is a principle of, in a free society, you are free to think what you want, and as a part of that process of expressing your opinions. Thought control is used by totalitarian or authoritarian societies. 1902, in Japan, it was a crime punishable by death to imagine the death of the emperor. Okay? Even the American colonies had a similar provision in a couple of the colonies. So we kind of think about this in terms of continuum. We think a lot of things all the time. We dream things. What if you had a dream about something, some harmful activity? If you dream of assassinating the president, could you be punishable for that? Well, the answer's got to be no. You can't help what you dream. We all have sort of evil thoughts inside of us along with good thoughts. We're complicated creatures. Well, what about we move from dream to being awake, but you're sort of daydreaming, you're sort of imagining killing the president or some other awful thing like that. Can you be punishable for that? Can you be punished for that? What if it's a more coherent thought in your thoughts during the day? You think about what you would do to kill the president. Should that be punished? At what point does it become a punishable kind of thing? You tell your neighbor about it. You tell your friend. You're moving closer toward action. Well, what if you start planning it? At what point along that continuum in thinking about killing somebody does the criminal justice system become justifiably involved? And under First Amendment doctrine, you cannot be blamed for your thoughts. You cannot be blamed legally for your thoughts, for your intentions, for your character. Only when you engage in a kind of activity that starts making the danger more imminent can you be punishable. Character itself is protected. Now, those of you that have studied philosophy, you will note the Kantian nature of this doctrine. Immanuel Kant, philosopher, moral philosopher, broader philosophy as well, argued that individuals are moral agents, responsible to themselves for their actions and their conduct. And if we respect the moral autonomy of individuals, we respect their rights to their own ideas, to their own ways of living, so long as those do not create demonstrable harm. And there's a very much of a Kantian nature, or a Kantian basis to the doctrines that I've been talking about. Now, above and beyond the core doctrines, there's sort of underlying principles of free speech that are important to bear in mind. And there's three categories of these. The first one is what's called deontological, which is Kantian, that it's a good in its own right, regardless of any particular consequences that might ensue from it. And the deontological aspect of free speech is the importance of freedom to the individual, of intellectual freedom, moral freedom to the individual to choose for himself or herself. It's a good in itself, independent of any particular consequences. Also, because we're imperfect creatures, we're going to have imperfect thoughts. And they need to be protected by law unless they lead to illegal conduct. Another deontological aspect of it is what's called democratic consent. And this is from people like the philosopher Ronald Dworkin. In a democratic society, based on ultimately the will of the people to determine what the government does, democratic authority rests upon the consent of the governed. And if you are not allowed to express your viewpoints on any particular issue of public policy, have you truly consented to what ensues from the government conduct and government decision making? If I'm not allowed to express my view about a controversial issue, why should I obey the law once a decision is made as to what to do about that particular issue? I have been disenfranchised. So the principle of democratic consent is another important aspect of the right of freedom of speech. Second set of principles underlying First Amendment analysis are what we call consequentialism. Good results that occur from free speech. And the first one is truth, the pursuit of truth. That's why I started this talk asking if you ever changed your mind. Can we, universities are all about the pursuit of truth. Truth is an important aspect of a democratic society. Can we pursue truth in a viable way if we don't entertain all different kinds of viewpoints that are relevant to the discussion at hand? People are imperfect. Different viewpoints need to be heard in order to move our way toward, to grope our way toward truth in a controversial world. Also, every society is based upon structures of power and interests that lock into certain points of view and certain injustices that need to be challenged. Every single movement in American history that pushed a minority point of view into public acceptance rode the back of free speech in order to get there. I think the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, where people stood up and expressed their views in opposition to the power at hand. And freedom of speech is crucial to that kind of end. All sorts of social issues and even scientific issues that at one time were accepted have been challenged and then modified on the basis of challenges of different points of view. And finally, there's an ethical character aspect of free speech, which is the ability to deal with challenge and conflict. Free speech requires certain character attributes, that you are able to listen to others in a thoughtful way and to accept the rigors of constitutional discourse and disagreement. It takes a certain amount of courage in order to engage in a free speech polity. But you engage in it in a way that also expresses, or also entails being willing to question yourself. And free speech is kind of a paradox. On one hand, we want people to push the envelope, to challenge thinking as it exists. Think Copernicus, when he challenged the old view of the universe, which was heliocentric, claimed in a letter to a friend that he was challenging God himself. That's the kind of courage he had. That I am changing our view of God's place in the universe and the earth's place in the universe. That took real courage. But, so you want that kind of chutzpah. I've talked about this in my new book. The chutzpah of free speech. The willingness to stick your neck out, to take challenge, to take criticism. That requires a certain amount of character and courage. At the same time, however, a free speech polity requires that people entertain sufficient due doubt about their positions. So they're willing to listen to others at the same time that they engage in their own kind of chutzpah. And I would argue this is a form of democratic character. The ability to stand up for your rights, the ability to express your views in the face of opposition, because that's how change, constructive change occurs. At the same time that you entertain the possibility that you might be wrong. And so you engage in a kind of thoughtful process of self-assertion and listening at the same time. It's a kind of a paradox of constitutional character. And there's a Supreme Court case that probably that expresses this the best is Justice Holmes in a 1919 opinion, which was a dissent, which later on became the accepted view of free speech, in which Holmes said, every society is based on people pushing their notions of justice, what he called fighting faiths. But in order to engage in your fighting faith in a thoughtful way, you have to at least entertain the possibility that you might be wrong. And that's really it's a delicate kind of balancing act when you think about it. To be assertive of your views, at the same time that you entertain a kind of doubt, that's a kind of aspect of character that gives thoughtfulness to our emotions and to our urges. And in some ways, that might be the most important First Amendment ethical character aspect of all. Okay. But, there are limits to First Amendment rights. I want to talk about two. First, in general First Amendment doctrine. Then I want to talk about higher education. It's a list of exceptions to free speech. No right is ever absolute. There are exceptions. There are limits. What's the famous line from the Supreme Court? You don't have a right to shout what in a crowded theater? Fire. It's not quite right. You don't have a right to shout fire falsely in a crowded theater. Even the Supreme Court misquotes that all the time. If it's a real fire, I guess you've got to say something. But anyway, here are the limits. Direct incitement to imminent lawless action that's likely to occur. If you are in a situation where people are listening, ready to act in an unlawful way, and you incite them, you encourage them to break the law, and they're likely to do it given their mindset. The space for thinking and deliberation on the part of the audience is no longer there. It's just sort of urge. That would cross a line. Example, Florida, 1978. Angry mob in front of a jail. Speaker says, 2468, who are you going to assassinate? He names a sheriff inside the jail. There's a racial case involving a person being held in the jail. And he was charged with extortion, meaning that he was putting pressure on the people in the jail to release the prisoner on the basis of force. That crossed a line. It was a direct incitement to imminent lawless action likely to occur. That's the first exception. Fighting words in extreme situations. Real case, Westboro Church case, you may have heard of it, where protesters at military funerals, these are people that are anti-gay, arguing in their own crazy way that American soldiers are being killed because God is mad at the country for tolerating homosexuality. Okay, it's an absurd, brutal kind of idea. It's protected speech in general, but what if you went up to a soldier's parents outside of the funeral and you started expressing that point of view to them face to face? Are you provoking them to engage in a hostile reaction? Supreme Court might argue in that case, that's a form of fighting words which could lead to a disturbing of the peace. Because it's face to face, it's very intense. It's a difference between a general expression of views and that kind of directed, targeted form of hostility. Threats. If you say something to someone, threaten their physical safety in a way in which a reasonable person would feel threatened, that crosses a First Amendment line as well. It's called a real threat. The criminal law is full of definitions of what a real threat is. But if you simply say, gee, you're a Denver Bronco fan, I ought to kill you, that's not a real threat. It's an unreasonable reaction. That would not be a threat. But if you call someone on the phone and say, I've been following you around, I want to hurt you, that could be seen as a real threat. That is a limit. Libel, falsehood about someone that hurts their reputation. Another example. A lot more I could say about that, but Supreme Court gives more protection of libel of public officials than it does of libels of private individuals. Obscenity, which is hardcore pornography, is not protected speech. And the reason for that is, it's a complicated set of reasons, but the court has held that hardcore porn, obscenity, appeals to the prurient interest in sex rather than to reason itself. And therefore, in principle, it's not protected by free speech. Privacy rights. If someone invades your privacy with points of view or expression that you don't want to hear, in a private context in which your right of privacy is protected by the law, so the privacy of your home, that would cross a line. And then finally, compelling speech from others. So those are sort of doctrinal limits, very simply put for the purposes of the short talk, but they're important because there are prudent limits to protect other social interests that have to be acknowledged. Final context of those is higher education. And this is a really interesting set of questions about how applicable these principles are to higher education in general. And so it makes sense just to compare First Amendment doctrine in general to academic freedom on campus. So start with first point. I mentioned how viewpoint discrimination is a First Amendment no-no, protected by free speech principles across the board. Doesn't exist as much in higher education, at least in certain contexts in higher education. Higher education has formal contexts, classrooms, academic settings, scholarly functions that are more formal academic endeavors. In a classroom, the professor has to stick to the subject matter more or less, right? If you're taking a class in physics, you don't want to get a diatribe on politics. And there's an actual case at Ottawa University in Canada where introduction course to physics, the professor said, I'm going to turn this class into a forum for how to politically organize and mobilize movements. And students complained. I mean, they wanted to take further physics classes. They had to have the basic information. He refused. He got fired. So in a classroom setting, you have to stick to the subject matter. Classroom discussions are based on content discrimination. They may not be based on viewpoint discrimination, if there are different points of view involving a particular issue being talked about, but they are based on content discrimination. So right away, there's a difference in higher education. Compelled speech. How many students have taken an exam when you didn't want to take one? Okay, pretty much everyone, I assume. Ever had to write a paper you didn't want to write? Ever had to make a speech in class you didn't want to make? So, after looking at what I said about general First Amendment doctrine, so Jeremy assigns a paper, you can say, well, that's compelled speech. I don't want to do this paper. Good luck with that, right? Because when it comes to university functions, you can be compelled to speak. There's a case in Texas where a Christian student, a Christian fundamentalist student, refused to play a part in a play that involves speech which she considered disrespectful of God. And the instructor said, well, you can't be in this play now. And she sued, claiming freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and she lost because of the context of the classroom. That this is a reasonable pedagogical purpose on the part of the professor that trumped her right not to say something that she disagreed with in that particular role. So compelled speech is allowed. I had to write stuff for tenure. I'm glad I wrote this stuff. Very important part of my career. I just love doing it, well, on the whole. But I had to do it, or I wouldn't have gotten the job, or I wouldn't have been given tenure. So compelled speech is part of higher education, isn't it? Let's go back to the military line about your military service case. No such thing as a false idea under the First Amendment, according to the court. Try that in math class. 2 and 2 is 5. All right? Class on the Holocaust. Holocaust never happened. What kind of grade are you going to get? According to the First Amendment general doctrine about truth and free speech, there are no experts allowed to have the final legal say. In the marketplace, of course, we hope that the experts will enlighten us and we will learn what's false and what's not, but we have to sift and winnow that for ourselves. In the classroom, if you believe in something that's patently false and can't back it up in any way, you're going to fail. And higher education is based on experts teaching non-experts. So, in that context as well, higher education is different. Also in terms of speech, and here's where you have a lot of interesting cases potentially. Something you would be allowed to say in a public forum on campus, or maybe we're just walking out in the general campus area, in a classroom might be inappropriate or wrong. I might have a view about some particular topic and express that in a very controversial way in the general public, but in class I have to respect the students. So let's say, a homophobic or a racist comment or belief, which would be protected in the general society. In classroom, I have to avoid that. I'll give you an example. Earl Butz, Northwestern University, Holocaust denier. He had a website. And in the website, you would express all sorts of he didn't believe the Holocaust occurred. It wasn't overtly, at least in a clear, obvious way, anti-Semitic, but the implication was clearly that. And Northwestern tried to take down the website, and they lost, because the website was considered a public forum the university provided. He had a right to do that. But when it came to class, he was an engineering professor. In the class itself, he never mentioned the Holocaust. He didn't cross that line. Meanwhile, a graduate student who was teaching a course in the school, or a lecturer, I forget which, not on the tenure track, the lecturer would spend time in his engineering classes talking about how wrong Butz was. And the engineering students complained, saying, this is an engineering class. It's not about the Holocaust. And the student was compelled, or the lecturer was compelled not to talk about the Holocaust in the engineering class, because the classroom is a special kind of domain where limits on speech would be more acceptable. So let me leave you with some examples of cases to think about, and then that'll be it. Down here. Nuremberg Files case. An anti-abortion group crosses off the names of doctors that they want that have been murdered for committing abortion, and its website interacts with readers. Okay, you may have heard of this case. And the website gives the names and addresses of doctors. So the website praises those who kill abortion doctors, provides the names and addresses of doctors, and when the doctor has been killed, it crosses the doctor's name off. In one case, it would put up like a skull and crossbones or some sort of symbol about that. Is that protected speech? Shaking your head, why not?
Because it's actionable, it's encouraging an immediate violent act. Seems like it crosses that line.
Seems like it's part and parcel of criminal activity. It's a tough case for a real free speech libertarian, but I think the line is crossed. It's an incitement to imminent lawless action. The crowd sort of into it. It's a little controversial. It's not like the angry crowd in front of the abortion doctor's clinic where you're then encouraging it. There, the incitement is clearly direct. But it's interactive enough that it's crossed the line. They were sued, and the appeals court upheld a lawsuit that destroyed that organization. Okay? A radical terrorist group advocates violence as a matter of general rhetoric. America should be destroyed. Protected? It's on a website. They put out pamphlets, they pass them around, protected. Okay. What if they interact with a terrorist group that is planning that kind of action? At some point, you're going to cross that line of protection. Westboro Church case, which I've mentioned, walking toward the cemetery, there's a funeral procession. They put up a sign that says, "Soldiers die to serve God," or "because of America's immorality." Is that protected? So maybe three contexts. You say it directly to the face of a parent of a soldier who's been killed. Two, you put the sign up and it's seen as the family and others march toward or walk toward the cemetery. Scenario three, you just put the sign up but nobody really sees it, which was the case in that particular case. What is protected, what isn't? A law prohibits burning a U.S. flag, it's a Texas case. And a person burns a flag to protest government action. Is that protected or not? Okay, you're burning the flag as a symbolic gesture, protesting the government. There's real content there about speech, and you're making a statement about politics. Person A burns a flag to protest government action. Person B burns one because he's interested in what color the fire of a flag would make. He has a bet with a friend. I say the color is going to be kind of blue. Friend said it's going to be kind of orange. So I burn the flag in public to show which color it's going to be. Is that protected speech? Is it the same kind of as person A who's doing it to protest government action? I would say no. You're not making any kind of expression of a viewpoint. You're not expositing an idea, which would kick the First Amendment into play. So the purpose behind burning the flag, I think, would matter. As a matter of fact, in the Texas versus Johnson case in 1989, the court ruled it did not strike down the part of the statute which made it a crime to desecrate the flag, per se. So to say, Johnson's burning the flag to protest Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party, which is pretty much what he did. That's case A, it's a real case. Texas Supreme Court reversed his conviction because he was using symbolic speech to make a political view, however controversial. I don't like flag burning, but I protect it to the end of the day. But what if Johnson had just been arrested for dragging the flag thoughtlessly through the mud and violated that part of the statute? That would not be a First Amendment violation because he's not presenting any kind of point of view. There's no free speech issue there. Okay? A student, we had issues like this in Madison. A student walks into a class wearing a gay pride t-shirt. And the next class, another student walks in wearing a t-shirt that says anti-gay pride. Is that t-shirt protected? Certainly in the general population, under First Amendment principle, it would have to be. What about in a classroom? Well, do you have a viewpoint problem there? It's okay to praise gay pride, but not okay to criticize it. So, at what point would the student be justifiably told not to wear that t-shirt? It's going to depend on circumstance, but you have a problem if you simply say you can't wear it, because that would be viewpoint discrimination. So those are some examples of First Amendment cases that have been controversial in general. So to summarize, we have this core doctrine, these basic principles, the pursuit of truth, ethical character, et cetera, that I talked about. There's sort of background principles of the doctrine. And we have examples of controversy. So hopefully that gives you something to think about. So I never know how to stop talking, I'm just going to stop. mean, why do we have these principles? We're the most protected free speech country in the world. Is that right? Sorry, I swallowed the wrong way, but go ahead.
Could you comment on basically public sanctions versus private sanctions?
Right.
In terms of constitutional right?
Well, private sanctions are not covered by the Constitution, right? I mean, the Constitution deals with government conduct. Bill of Rights only applies to organs of the state. First of all, it says Congress shall pass no law. Courts have applied that beyond Congress. If I had a longer time to talk, I'd talk about how that happened. Why can't the president do something about speech? Why can't a school board? Because the court now has said that they're all forms of state action, which makes it the government. Okay, so the only part of the Constitution that that prohibits private action is the 13th Amendment prohibition of slavery. Okay, so in this private sector, you may not put people into slavery. Otherwise, it's only the government. But obviously, if there's what Mill called, in Tocqueville too, in a certain way, social censure. Social censure can be good as a way of expressing your opinion about what someone is saying, in a way to present a counter view, but it can also be oppressive in its own right, if it's not done in a way which is constructive in terms of the principles of free speech. So you have a right to say something, but we will shame you and shun you if you say it. That can be just as detrimental to free speech in our society as government sanction itself. And for some people, it might even be tougher because we're social creatures and that affects them more. So on one hand, it's a legitimate form of response to speech that you profoundly disapprove of. On the other hand, it can go too far and lead to a real chilling of honest and open expression. So I think it should be informed by the basic principles so it's done in the right way. But yeah, it can definitely be a problem. And if you have a culture that's one-sided politically, one side in terms of a particular moral point of view on a controversial question where there are reasonable positions on different sides, that can be just as harmful as government censorship. And that's a matter of education and trying to teach people how to respond in a thoughtful way to something they really profoundly disagree with rather than simply shunning it. Or social bullying, online bullying, huge problem. Both sides of the political aisle now. I think when my book comes out in 2 weeks, I'm going to get hit by people. It's happened before. I've been threatened online from sources that would really surprise you. But it happens, and that's a real problem. People are afraid. If you're afraid to be intellectually honest, can you have a university? Can you have a really free society? I would argue no. People have to be willing to express their views, otherwise it doesn't work. They're hurting their own rights. They're hurting the positive functions of free speech when it happens. But that doesn't mean that people should be immune to criticism. There's no such thing as a false idea in the general sphere of free speech as opposed to academic speech. But you sure as hell want to tell somebody that's wrong, and here's why. So we need to sift and winnow truth from falsehood everywhere. But you got to be careful how you. This is sort of Holmes's point. That your own urge to censor is a fighting faith that has no room for reasonable disagreement. Then you're harming the process. So it's a great question. Yeah, Mr. Monroe, Professor Monroe.
This sort of relates to the bullying and also the answer earlier about the incitement to the media threat. There was
Right.
an actual case on this campus, an instance where a disgruntled graduate student sent a fax to some people that worked in Agnes Arnold Hall saying that they were such bad people and had done such terrible things that the same thing should happen to Agnes Arnold Hall as happened in Oklahoma City.
Wow.
It was disturbing to people in Agnes Arnold Hall.
Understandably.
But so far as I know, there wasn't any attempt
Right.
to have the person arrested or
Right.
arraigned or anything like that based
Right.
on that communication.
Right.
So is that free speech?
Yeah, I mean, I assume he's making the argument for reasons having to do with their beliefs or some sort of public policy angle, or is it just purely personal?
Well, it wasn't happy that he was kicked out of the
Right.
graduate program in history.
Right. I think you wouldn't go after it unless it constitutes a real threat. You go back to the exceptions that we talked about, where you gotta really have a line that society may enforce. To a large extent, the exceptions to free speech, maybe with the possible exception of obscenity, those are limited exceptions, partly based on the court's experience over the decades, that other exceptions that are broader just don't work. They either don't protect speech or they become so open-ended and vague that there's too much discretion in the application of the law. So there's no consistency. So these doctrines, like the standard about direct incitement to imminent loss action likely to occur is a pretty clear standard. It's not perfect. No such standards are perfect. But it's the closest thing we can get to a consistent standard that can be applied equally in different cases. And the case law involving that standard has been no one's really complaining about it. You know, the Nuremberg Files case might be a problem in that it's sort of gray there. But it's still, I think we've got the right answer in the end. Is it a threat? If he did it more than once, we can start talking about harassment, which I haven't talked a lot about here. But harassment's another exception. And there's a Supreme Court standard on that. Sort of harassment related to the notion of threat. So he may have crossed a line there. Certainly if he did it again. Because being repeated is an important aspect of harassment. So I would say, threat, harassment. But if it's a sort of a general feeling about these people, then that's going to be protected. But it should be criticized, especially given the context.